Alright, what is up? Welcome back to another video. Today's video is going to be a quick starter guide on everything you need to know to get into film photography. So we'll start off here. This is a Minolta SRT Super, just a 35mm SLR system, and likely what you might be starting out with. These cameras are owned by a lot of people, including dads, grandpas, aunts, uncles, thrift shop owners. This is fairly common. You might end up with something like this, something like this, something like this. But functionally, they're all the same camera, so for the sake of my limited desk room, we're just gonna keep with this. Now, the SLR system stands for single lens reflex, meaning there's a prism here. So you look through the viewfinder here, through the prism, through the mirror, through the lens, meaning whatever it is you're looking at through the viewfinder is exactly what the lens sees, exactly what we're taking a photo of. You can make sure that you are in focus by articulating the focus ring on your lens, making sure that the image is sharp. There are other systems out there as well, such as rangefinders and zone focus cameras, such as the Pentax 17 here. This basically has set zones in which the lens focuses to, and you can use the pictographs located here or the numbers located here as a rough estimation as to what focus you want to be shooting at, whether that's infinity, a little bit further away, a little bit closer, your cutlery, or a flower. So that's helpful there. And rangefinders have somewhat of a similar mechanism of focus, where you don't actually get to see the image itself that's in focus, but you have a focus patch and you line that up with the image that you're seeing in order to create focus. So a couple different variations of cameras there. We're going to stick with the 35mm SLR because this is by and far the most common of them. So with something like this, what you need first is a lens. This is a standard, relatively standard 55mm 1.7 Minolta SR lens. 50mm is kind of where I recommend people start at. The human eye sees roughly like 46mm. So 50 is not too far away from that, and it's a fairly good place to begin, just to get an idea of taking a photo, how to compose shots, how to frame things. And then from there, once you've established a baseline, you can explore more options, whether that's a tighter lens, such as an 80mm, or a wider lens, such as a 28. So the lower the number, the wider the focal length is, and the higher the number, the more telephoto focal length is. 50mm is like right in the middle. That's why I typically recommend that. Then you have the 1.7 that I mentioned there, and that is your maximum aperture. So that is how much light the lens can let in. The smaller the number, the more light it lets in. The bigger the number, the less light it lets in. So we'll notice the blades open and close as I adjust the aperture here. So this has a range of 1.7 to 16. You'll notice the closer I move to 16, the more stop down the lens gets, meaning less light gets in, making it very good for a sunny day, and also that has a direct correlation to your depth of field, meaning how much of the image is in focus. The more light you let in, the shallower your depth of field is, the sharper the focus drop-off is going to be. The more your lens is stopped down, the deeper your depth of field is. And there's a similar correlation with your focal length as well. The wider the lens is, the more is going to be in focus. The tighter the lens is, the sharper that focus is going to be. On some lenses, there's even a little diagram here which will show just that. You can see that there is a bracketing system for 16, 8, and 4. So if I have this set at 16, I have the focus set to 15 feet, that means that anything between 10 feet and infinity, that's all going to be in focus. And then as it moves in, less and less of that will be in focus up until we get to the point where it says 1.7, which is just that line right there. We have these numbers up here on this dial. This is going to be your shutter speeds. Now the shutter speed is how long the shutter is open for. Shutter, of course, being something like this, either a cloth system back here or vertical metal blades such as this. So as I fire in advance, the blades articulate like that, and as I fire in advance, the shutter articulates like that. These are probably going to be a little more common for your beginner SLRs. This is kind of where the technology started, It then moved on to the vertical traveling because they can move at faster speeds and have higher flash sync speeds. But for all intents and purposes, this is your shutter. These are your shutter speeds. We have the largest number here, 1000. Some cameras can go up to 2000, some can go up to 4000, some can go up to 8000, so on and so forth. But 1000 is pretty standard for a lot of beginner SLR systems, and that's plenty fast enough. Because 1000 is 1/1000th of a second, meaning that's going to let in very little light. It's also going to get crisp detail of movement. So if you're doing any kind of like fast photography, such as like sports or wildlife, faster speeds are typically better because you get sharper images, you get that more static motion. The lower your speed goes, the longer that your shutter remains open for, meaning more light gets in, more time lapses, meaning you're going to get more motion blur. That's still beneficial at times because if you're shooting at darker periods of the day, then having slower speeds means you can bring more light in. And you can get cooler effects with, if cars drive by, you get more streaks of light, you get more blur of people, all of these things. There is a benefit to it as well. Now you'll notice that there is a red 60 right here, and that is for your flash sync speed. So if I had a flash unit sitting on this camera, on the hot shoe right here, and I shot it at 60, that's going to initiate the flash to go off, and it's going to create a burst of light that is going to match the 1/60th of a second shutter speed. So you can use that if you're shooting an indoor setting just to get that extra bit of light. There's also batteries. Best thing to do is look up your specific camera and look up the battery that needs. There are a lot of these older cameras, especially like something like the Spotmatic here, which required mercury batteries at the time. Obviously we don't do those anymore, but there are plenty of replacements, such as the 387S for the Spotmatic. They're a little bit more expensive, but the energy output is about the same. Ultimately, it's not going to affect your meter reading too much. Power is important for a lot of these cameras. Some of them need power in order to operate. Some of them are more mechanical. It depends on what system you have, and that's more case specific. So I encourage you to watch any of the videos on my channel regarding the specific camera you have, or I will link down below a good site that has access to plenty of manuals, all free. You can of course donate to the gentleman keeping the sites running. I'm sure he'd appreciate that. But for all intents and purposes, there's manuals there, so you can get better one-on-one on how to use your camera. But the metering system on something like this is a K1000 with the top removed, is very simple. You have 3 CDS cells right here. CDS stands for cadmium sulfide. Basically, it is a light resistor. So light comes in, and with power, the cells offer resistance dependent on the amount of light coming in. If you look through the viewfinder, you may be able to see there's a slight needle in there. That needle has to be set in the middle in order to reach accurate exposure, and you can do so by adjusting the shutter speed, the aperture, or the film speed that you have. Very, very complicated stuff, but just for the sake of simplification, you have your 3 inputs, which is your shutter speed, your aperture, your ASA, and then you have the light that's coming in. And you want these to equal each other in order to achieve proper exposure. Your ASA is going to be your film sensitivity. So we have something like this, 400 Tri-X, that's going to have a 400 ASA. Now you can do different things, you can push and you can pull, but if you're just getting into film photography, I recommend just shooting at the box speed just so you get a feel of it. So that's going to be kind of a set variable. That's not something you can really adjust on the fly because then it will affect all of the other shots on that roll. Ultimately, some shots will become over, underexposed, whatever. Once you load a film in there, set the ASA to a certain setting, and then I would say just leave it there. Aperture and your shutter speed. And as I mentioned, your shutter speed is going to affect the amount of time that the shutter remains open for. So if you don't mind a little bit more motion blur, maybe you can let in more light. If you want more refined images, maybe you want to keep it at a faster shutter speed. And your aperture is going to affect your depth of field. It's going to affect your focus. So if you want sharper focus, maybe you want to have the aperture open more. Maybe you want to have the aperture stop down more so you have more depth of field, more in focus. All of these things correlate to achieve equilibrium with the light. It's very complex if you think about individual circumstances, but the overall principle is fairly simple. So now those are kind of the basics of film photography itself, and I guess photography more generally. Let's talk about modern day photography. You just got a camera. Now you know kind of what battery to get. You know how to find information on your specific camera, how to use it. Now we need to talk about film. Where do you get film? There's a few options out there. Depending on where you live, there might be a local camera store for you. I would recommend checking them out because it's always important to support smaller businesses. But I also think it's fair to note that their stock might be limited and their prices might be a little bit high. So if you're kind of shooting on a budget, my recommendations are Freestyle Photo. They're located in LA, thereabouts, and they have very affordable film with a variety of film stocks, cheaper black and white such as Arista EDU and Kentmere. That's where I might recommend you start off on because they're like $5 a roll, easy to get into, easy to kind of figure out, and you're not going to blow a bunch of money and take bad photos. You'll take bad photos and, be able to save and continue to refine the craft, so to speak. If you're more on the East Coast, there's other companies out there. Reformed Film Lab has the new Lucky black and white film, which is from China, but it's, again, about $5, pretty affordable stuff. There's also B&H is a very popular one. They have relatively good stock and consistent supply. There's also Brooklyn Film Camera, has a lot of stuff there as well. My recommendation is Freestyle Photo. Very responsive, a lot of great stock, super fast shipping. So I would check out their site first. I will link that down below as well as the others I mentioned if you want to buy film. Again, my recommendations are start with black and white, Kentmere, Arista EDU, Lucky black and white film, all of the more affordable options there, just so you can kind of get an understanding of how film photography works, understand the basics of light and all of that stuff, composition, all of that's very important. In terms of a film lab, there are many out there. There are a lot that you can mail into, and again, depending on where you live, you might want to have one locally. I would check out your local options because it's kind of cool to develop a rapport with the local film lab. There's also, like I mentioned, many options you can mail things out to. I believe Reformed Film Lab does do developing and stuff in-house, so you might want to check them out. My recommendation is The Darkroom, also in California. You mail your film into them. You can use their website to get your order ready. Their prices are, I think, $13 a roll for development and scans. They're going to offer you medium res or high res scans. High res scans are good if you wanted to do like larger prints or something like that. But for all intents and purposes, if you're just going to look at these on your phone, maybe post them to Instagram or just share them with friends and family, medium res is just fine for that sake. So those are some of your development options there. Now we have a couple other things I will go through very briefly. We have something like this, and we have something like this. But we'll start here. This is a 35mm point and shoot camera. This might be something that you find at like a thrift store, or your mom might have had one on a vacation or something like that. They're fine, they're affordable, they're usually very plasticky and something like that. They can be a lot of fun. I would just say exercise caution. Don't spend too much on these because the electronics in here are very old and likely trying not to work. So be careful with that. Anything more than like $50 is probably too much on something like this. There are other options. There are other models that are much nicer, have better electronics, better mechanics you might want to spend more on. But for all intents and purposes, I would recommend something like this or something like a rangefinder just to get into photography. This is a good backup. It's good for fun, but it's not really like a great place to begin because you don't have any of the controls of this. You don't have aperture control. You don't have shutter speed control. You just have an on-off switch, pretty much. They're still fun, very pocketable, very lightweight, easy to use, but it's just not going to be the same experience. It's basically like taking a picture on your phone, except with extra steps and extra costs involved. So, still good, nothing to snuff at. If If you want to get into it, there's plenty out there. Maybe if you want to get into the idea of shooting film more seriously, this gives you the option to control your settings more, to learn from it and kind of exercise that skill even more. Then we have something like this, which is a medium format system. This is a TLR, twin lens reflex. So you have your viewing lens and your taking lens here. You'll notice that there are blades in there which serve as your shutter blades. You can adjust those speeds like this, doesn't matter. Medium format holder looks something like this, meaning it is slightly larger than your 35mm film roll. So this basically means you get a little bit more sharper definitions, sharper detail, but the downside is you get fewer shots. Depending on what camera you have, this is a 6x6. You're going to have 12 exposures for a roll of film. If you have 6x4, you get 16. If you have 6x7, you have 10. 6x8, I think is like 8. And then 6x9, I think is, I'm not entirely sure. I've not shot those formats. But for all intents and purposes, you have fewer shots on this. The quality might be a little bit higher, but again, there's always going to be a correlation there in terms of cost, because these are going to probably cost about as much, if not more than 35, but you get fewer shots. So that's something to bear in mind. But if you do want to get into medium format photography, something like this Yashica Mat LM costs about $100, and they are pretty fantastic cameras. Super easy to use, simple 80mm 3.5 lens. And the other thing to bear in mind, we talked about the focal length of lenses here. Focal length of medium format is different, obviously, because your film exposure plane is wider, so an 80mm is a more equivalent correlation to a 50mm. So there are differences there as well. But I think that pretty much covers the basics for your 35mm film photography experience. My final note would be, once you shoot the film, once you send it out to get developed, hold on to your negatives. Even if you don't want to, even if you just get the scans done and you're like, that's all I want to use, hold on to your negatives, because you can then use those at a future day. If you want to do a larger print of a specific frame and you have your negatives, you can do that. But if you get rid of the negatives and all you have are the digital scans, then that's it. I think a big part of shooting film, being able to have that physical representation of the photo that you took, and then making sure that you have a place to store it. So I would recommend getting a binder and getting film holders. I will put those links down below. Freestyle Photo has those for sale. Amazon has them for sale as well. Very important. If you want to get into something like that, that would be my recommendation. So film photography is a lot of fun. There's a lot of different ways in which you could do it. This is kind of a very generalized, rough overview of how to get into this specific variation of it. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please again feel free to leave those down below. My final thought recommendation is, if you haven't developed a coffee addiction just yet, there's no better time to start than now. This is the perfect pairing of the two. You've got coffee, you've got film. You're going to spend a lot of money on both, and hopefully you can then fill the void that lies within you. So thank you very much for watching. I hope this helps. Like the video if you enjoy it, subscribe to the channel. If you have any specific questions about any of the cameras, leave those down below. Check out my channel for other videos, tips, and guides, and things like that. Thank you again. I'll catch you on the next one.